the next piece that we're going to talk about is the moral foundation of the precautionary principle. This piece is looking at a specific thing that's referenced in several of the works that we're interested in. Seems to be pretty heavily used when we talk about environmental policy and sustainability. I want to take a moment to read this part of this piece so that you get really clear on what the precautionary principle is and what people mean when they talk about it. The precautionary principle is an important guideline that has been used in policy and sustainability science to guide and limit the implementation or continued experimentation of certain things. So it's been used to push back or to check things using governmental influence and policy. In basic terms, the principle says that in the face of reasonable fear of severe harmful effects on people or the environment, governments may be justified in imposing measures to prevent harm, even in the absence of conclusive scientific evidence. The idea here is that sometimes just the worry that there may be harm that could come from doing something or adopting something or persisting in developing a technology may be enough for government to enforce a check against it. Even though this principle has been widely used, it's not really clearly defined. So the author of this piece is interested in trying to provide a moral foundation for applying the precautionary principle. So he's going to give us where the precautionary principle comes from and what it's founded on in order to have a deeper understanding of it. To start the piece, Jensen talks about the liberal context that the precautionary principle came out of. For the most part, trying to figure out when and how to use the precautionary principle happens when we're trying to balance two considerations. We're trying to balance freedom and the rights of individuals, institutions, and organizations, and the need to reduce harm to the environment, humans, animals, and plant health. We're trying to figure out, should we invoke the precautionary principle? Should we not? What we're considering is balancing these two things. These considerations and their importance are tied to liberalism. We did cover this briefly in a previous unit, but we're going to talk about it a little bit more in the context of this article. Liberalism holds that liberty and rights of individuals are important, and an important role of the state is to protect these things. Jensen suggests that invoking the precautionary principle, particularly the way that he lays it out as defined by the Commission for European Communities, rests on being guided by the liberal principle. So he's going to give us a definition for the liberal principle, which is supposed to capture the core commitment of liberalism. So the liberal principle he defines as the only reason for which persons may be restricted in their actions by the use of coercion is to prevent unwarranted harm to entities worthy of protection. This principle is widely referred to in ethics as the harm principle. I think I mentioned the harm principle earlier. The idea here is that a core commitment of liberalism is that liberty and freedom to act is important. And so the only time that an individual can coercively be stopped from exercising his freedom, his autonomy, or his liberty is when he's going to harm somebody else. And that's what we call in ethics the harm principle, what Jensen is calling the liberal principle. Basically, the idea is that the only limits that are acceptable on personal freedom come when an individual is harming other individuals or entities that deserve consideration. This principle generally does not allow for people's freedoms to be restricted for things that are for their own good or because it would benefit others. Rather, it's limited to restricting harms. Jensen suggests that these kinds of restrictions on freedom, the ones like you can be restricted for your own good or for the benefit of others. When we say things like that, we're not really acting in accordance to liberalism or a liberal approach. We're acting in what he calls a welfare approach. So on this kind of approach, it is sometimes permissible to restrict somebody's freedom against their will in their own interests or for the interests of others. But that's different than liberalism. Traditionally, the liberal principle has only been concerned with freedom of action of individuals and protecting individual agents for harm. However, more recently been generally accepted that protection from harm can be extended to other beings, so animals, plants, and the environment. What Jensen calls entities worthy of protection. In traditional liberalism, we would generally just be considering human individuals, human moral agents, but he thinks that there's been a lot of work that shows that other things, what he calls entities worthy of protection, animals, plants, the environment, can be considered, can be protected from harm. Jensen also clarifies that from a liberal point of view, not all harm is not permitted or unacceptable. For example, offense is not usually considered a harm. So there's a large literature on hate speech and like catching these things out. But generally speaking, feeling offense at something is not really considered a harm on liberalism. So there are certain things that liberalism is just not going to consider as a protected harm, as something that you should be protected from. Therefore, the main concern when we apply the liberal principle is how to balance an acceptable level of protection for entities worthy of protection with only interfering with a person's rights and liberties as much as strictly necessary and no more. And this is because it's core to liberalism that people's freedom and liberty is important and must be protected. So that's why there's this kind of limit. Jensen goes on to a little bit to talk about what has been considered acceptable for the foundation of individual rights on different liberal accounts. But basically, the upshot here is that while liberalism is pretty diverse, how the details of it spell out on different accounts vary. Jensen believes that broadly, most liberal accounts would accept the liberal principles. So he's admitting there's a lot of variation in liberal theories, but he thinks overall, most of them would accept the liberal principle as he's presented it. Jensen traces how there are strands of extending protection to risk from harm of life and health that can be found in important classical liberal theories, but he acknowledges that most classical liberal theories would not consider environments or plant life worthy of protection. He says, well, we might be able to find basis for extending kind of protection from risk of harm to health and life in traditional liberal theories. You're probably not going to find an idea of extending that to plants and animals. But he acknowledges that work in environmental ethics has given us compelling reasons to accept that we should extend protection to certain entities. He specifically talks about the work of Paul Taylor and Holmes Rolston III. So he's like, okay, yes, in classical liberalism, you're not going to find this. But I think this more recent work and how it fits with the liberal framework shows that these are compatible and that we can go ahead and assume that it's compatible with liberalism to extend protection to these other entities. It's also compatible with liberalism to accept that legal entities, for example, businesses and organizations, have some rights and liberties. So it's important in the liberal tradition that the right to enter voluntarily into contracts is protected, but it's still generally considered compatible with liberalism that certain restrictions on free trade can be justified to prevent harm to third parties. So he's pointing out here a lot of the protection from risk of harm that we're going to be interested in is going to be when industries or companies are engaging in free market practices. And so he wants to be clear that, yes, it's compatible with liberalism to be concerned with harm to third parties when people are entering into kind of voluntary free market transactions, including industries and businesses. From all this, Jensen concludes that if a government wants to restrict or prohibit a certain product or process by citing its potential harmful effects, liberalism requires this reason to be weighty enough to justify specific restrictions on the actions of individuals and companies. It is therefore generally assumed that these kinds of restrictions have to be based on and supported by compelling evidence of assumed harmful effects, as well as the frequency and severity. He's saying, because of how seriously we take restricting liberty and freedom, it's generally accepted that on liberalism, if we're going to restrict liberty and freedom, we have to have compelling scientific evidence, including frequency, severity, and the nature of the harmful effect in order to justify that kind of a limit. However, the precautionary principle seeks to extend the right of restriction on freedom past what is compellingly proven. Core to the precautionary principle that it is precautionary, that it is in absence of definitive evidence, we are cautious. We take the stand that no, it's okay to restrict this just if there is a chance or a compelling reason to think that there might be harm, regardless of whether or not it's been scientifically proven. But seeks to address cases where there are reasonable grounds for concern that potential hazards may affect the environment or human, animal, and plant life, but there is insufficient or inconclusive scientific data to fully and conclusively identify the effects. In these cases, the precautionary principle claims that the decision makers can act to restrict rights and liberties in order to reduce alleged risk. So hopefully now you're clear on what the precautionary principle seeks to do and why it's a bit tricky. It's tricky because it allows for restricting freedom and liberties, something that liberalism seeks to protect from. in cases where there's not conclusive proof of harm, but only a risk of harm. So this is why it's tricky, because it's extending what we can infringe on personal liberties and freedoms for to things that are not just conclusively proven, but things that are just a risk of harm. The author then goes on to address the question of when can the precautionary principle be applied. Basically, he's asking when does balancing the restrictions of liberty and the risk of harm warrant invoking the precautionary principle. To start to answer this question, Jensen says that the commission provided two precursors to involving the precautionary principle. So two things that have to be true for the precautionary principle to be. And this is one, that there is an identification of potential negative effects for the thing under consideration. And two, that there is something in the scientific analysis of the risks that make it possible to determine with sufficient certainty, make it impossible to determine with sufficient certainty that the nature of the risk in question. However, he acknowledges that this is good, or it's a good start, it's a good guideline, but it's a long way from being like a clear and uncontroversial workable practice. We're still left with a lot of questions like what is an acceptable level of risk? What are allowable mitigating factors that allow a scientific assessment to be impossible? So hopefully you now have a pretty clear understanding of the precautionary principle and why it's tricky. That's really what I want you to take from this piece.